Hello, Gateway ladies. I hope you've been enjoying our mini series on the fruit of the Spirit. I'm going to do a couple of wrap ups now to just put into context the verses that we've been studying on the fruit of the Spirit, and just to help us understand why did Paul put that there. So Paul was the writer of the book of Galatians, and he was writing to a group of churches where he had traveled to, and he had preached a gospel of grace. And he's writing to correct something that had happened in that a sector of the churches or church had decided to add to the requirement for salvation, and say that circumcision was also required to be saved, as well as the blood of Jesus. And he is very cross about this. He's very angry. And in chapter 3, verse 1, he says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" You can feel he's very, very angry. He's very upset and indignant that they have been bewitched, his words, and diverted from the truth. So he then goes on to explain the discussion or the argument between law and grace, and explains the differences between those two. And so he then I'm going to pick up in chapter 5 in verse 1, and it says, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." So he's saying, don't go back. Jesus came to set us free. You are not to be bound up again by the things that you were bound up by before. There's no point in getting free and then going back to the chains. And then in verse 2 it says, "Look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you." So he's saying, if you think circumcision is all it takes to be saved, then what value is the blood of Jesus? It's totally undermining all the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross if they believe that circumcision is also required. And then in verse 11, he says, "But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed." So he's saying, if I was preaching circumcision, I wouldn't be persecuted, but I am. So I'm not preaching circumcision as a requirement for salvation. I'm preaching grace, and that is offensive to some of the people who are now persecuting him. So he's arguing that, and goes on in verse 13, "For you were called to freedom." Again, second time in the same chapter, he's saying you were called to freedom. Don't go back. Don't go back and get wrapped up in those chains and pulled down by human laws and all this. This is not what God's purpose for you, and this is not why Jesus came. He says, "Do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." This is our way of staying others focused, making sure that we don't slip back. So how do we apply this to the here and now? What does this mean to us? Because we generally don't look at circumcision as a requirement for anything in our culture. So how does this apply to us? So basically, we need to make sure that we stay absolutely rooted to what the word says. We are not to take on cultural habits or human rules or personal preferences and add them to what we require people to do to be saved. It's not the Bible and, oh, you have to dress like this, or it's not the Bible and, oh, you shouldn't wear jewelry, or you shouldn't do this, or you must do that. These are human and cultural issues that are not requirements for salvation, and we need to be very careful that If we find people preaching, or we find ourselves adding on to the gospel, we need to be very careful, because that's not what the gospel says. We are saved very clearly by grace through faith. And this is the gospel. There is no other. We are saved by grace, which is unearned favor from Jesus, from God. And there's no other way to be saved. And our belief in that is a faith in the grace of God. That is the way we are saved, not through any other way. So that's part one of the wrap up.